A forbidden forest holds the only cure for a dying village. Kaelen, a young botanist with everything to lose, steps into the Whispering Woods, a place his elders forbade for generations. The air itself feels alive here, and every shadow seems to watch him with a strange, knowing intent. His mission is to find a legendary healing moss, but the risk is absolute failure, which means exile or a far worse fate. By the end of this story, you will witness how a single desperate choice can awaken an ancient consciousness and change the fate of two worlds forever. What secrets lie within a forest that remembers every footstep? What happens when the trees themselves begin to speak? What would you risk to save everyone you love from a slow, creeping death? The steel blade was a hair's breadth from the ancient bark when the word formed in the air around him. Stop. It was not a sound carried on the wind, but a voice that seemed to condense from the silence itself, clear and absolute. Kalen's hand froze, his muscles locking. The trowel clattered against the exposed roots, its metallic ring a stark intrusion in the sudden stillness. He watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the patch of luminous green moss he had been about to harvest shivered. It did not simply tremble in a breeze, for there was none. It contracted, pulling itself back into the deep grooves of the oak's bark, until not a single speck remained visible. It was a physical impossibility, a defiance of every botanical principle he had ever been taught. His mind fractured into warring halves. One screamed of rational explanations, of tricks of the mind born from exhaustion and fear. The other stood witness to the undeniable truth that the forest was not just alive, but aware. The air grew thick, pressing in on him as if the very atmosphere had turned to water. The gentle, ambient sounds of the woods had ceased, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a presence. The personal stake of his mission, the salvation of his village, was now eclipsed by a more primal terror. He had not just entered a forbidden place. He had trespassed against a conscious will. Swallowing a lump of pure dread, he made a choice that defied all his instincts. He spoke into the waiting quiet, his voice a fragile thing. "Who is there?" The words hung in the heavy air, unanswered. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, from a high branch of the very oak that had spoken, a single golden leaf loosened itself. It did not fall randomly, tossed by a capricious gust. It drifted down in a slow, deliberate spiral, a perfect pendulum swing, until it came to rest on the forest floor directly before his boots. Its stem pointed like an arrow, away from the path he knew and deeper into the shadowed, waiting heart of the woods, an invitation or a command. Trusting the golden leaf's guidance felt like stepping off the edge of the world. Kaelen pushed into a wall of thorns and twisted vines, which scraped at his arms and tugged at his clothes with a strange reluctance, as if the forest itself was unsure about letting him pass. Each step was a struggle, a physical argument with the undergrowth, until finally he stumbled into a clearing that stole his breath. The trees here formed a perfect, silent circle, their trunks immense and smooth, their canopy woven so tightly that the twilight beyond was completely shut out. The air itself was different, thick and humming, with a low, resonant energy that vibrated in his teeth and settled deep within his bones. A primal fear screamed at him to run, to escape this unnervingly geometric place. Yet a deeper, more powerful curiosity held him fast, a burning need to understand the intelligence that had orchestrated his arrival. His mission for the moss felt like a story from another lifetime, a small and distant concern compared to the immediate, immense presence surrounding him. Swallowing his terror, he made a choice that felt both foolish and inevitable. He walked to the very center of the grove and slowly sat upon the soft, moss-covered ground, crossing his legs. Closing his eyes, he willed his racing heart to calm and did the one thing he had never considered. He stopped fighting the forest and instead opened his mind to it, listening not with his ears, but with his entire being. The stakes were no longer just his village's survival, but his own, balanced on the edge of communicating with a mind so vast and ancient, it could either save him or erase him without a second thought. When he finally dared to open his eyes again, the world had transformed. The grove was now bathed in a soft, ethereal light, a bioluminescent glow emanating from the mosses and fungi that clung to the circle of trees. And then, a new voice formed in his mind, clear as crystal and undeniably directed at him. "You listen." The voice was not a single sound, but a cascade of images and sensations that flooded his mind. He saw centuries unfold in a heartbeat, witnessed the slow, patient dance of trees as they communicated through their roots, sharing nutrients and warnings across vast distances. He felt the profound symbiosis of the forest, a network of life where every fungus, every insect, and every plant played a vital role. And then came the other memories, sharp and painful. The bite of axes, the scar of fire, the slow poison of greed as humans took and took without ever giving back. This consciousness, this Sylva, as he instinctively named it, had been watching, learning, and remembering every injury. His quest for the moss was not a noble mission here. It was just the latest act in a long history of theft. Kaelin's hands began to tremble, not from fear of the supernatural, but from a crushing, personal guilt. His people, his own ancestors, were the source of that remembered pain. He was just one more human, reaching into this sacred space to take something. The judgment he felt was not angry, but deeply weary, and that was somehow far worse. He wrestled with the weight of this history, his own desperation, now tangled with the shame of his kind. To prove his intentions were different felt impossible. Words seemed so flimsy against the backdrop of centuries, yet he had to try. He made a choice, a pivot that felt more significant than any step he had taken so far. He bowed his head and spoke his apology aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "I am sorry for my intrusion. I came only to take, blinded by my own need. I ask for nothing. I will only accept what you are willing to give." The silence that followed was absolute, a held breath of the entire grove. The stakes were no longer just about his life or his village's cure. They were about the possibility of a truce, a fragile bridge of understanding between two worlds that had been enemies for generations. One wrong word, one false movement, and that hope would shatter forever. Then something touched his wrist. A slender, living vine, adorned with tiny silver leaves, coiled gently around his arm. There was no force in its grip, no threat. It was a guide. It tugged softly, pulling him to his feet and leading him toward the edge of the clearing, where the roots of the great trees cradled a small, hidden spring. The water within did not simply reflect the grove's ethereal light. It pulsed with a soft, internal radiance, as if liquid starfire flowed from the very heart of the earth. The water of the spring pulsed with a soft, living light, illuminating the face of a single, perfect water lily floating upon its surface. Its petals were not merely white, but seemed woven from solidified moonlight. Sylva's presence guided his gaze not to the flower itself, but to its very center, where a single, pearlescent spore glowed with an intensity that outshone the water around it. A new understanding flowed into his mind, not in words, but in a pure, crystalline instruction. This one spore, if nurtured with respect, held the generative power to heal his entire village. It was not a supply to be harvested, but a seed of renewal to be gifted. Kaelin's hand trembled as he reached out, not with the trowel, but with his bare fingers. He did not pluck it. He waited, his open palm hovering just above the blossom, until the spore detached of its own volition and drifted down to land upon his skin. It was weightless, yet it carried the mass of an entire world. In that moment, the full scope of the transaction became terrifyingly clear. He had not simply been given a cure. He had been appointed an ambassador. The fate of two worlds now rested on his ability to bridge a chasm of fear and misunderstanding that had taken generations to dig. How could he possibly make them understand? How could he explain a sentient forest to people who only saw firewood and foraging grounds? They would see his story as the ravings of a fevered mind, a desperate lie concocted to cover his failure. The weight of this responsibility settled on his shoulders, a burden far heavier than any pack he had carried into the woods. He looked from the glowing spore in his hand to the silent, watching trees, and he made a vow. I will make them listen. I will show them that our survival is tied to yours. I swear it. This was no longer just a promise to save his people from illness. It was a pact to save them from themselves and to protect the woods from their ignorant wrath. Failure would mean more than a return of the sickness. It would mean provoking the conscious, defensive power of a wounded ecosystem, a force his village could not possibly comprehend or withstand. As he turned, the glowing spore carefully secured in a small leather pouch, he looked back toward the path that had led him here. His breath caught. The way was gone. The wall of thorns and vines had closed, not with hostility, but with a quiet, expectant finality. There was no visible trail, only the deep, shadowed woods. His return home would not be a simple retracing of his steps. It would be the first test of the trust he had just pledged, a journey that would demand he rely not on his own memory, but on the subtle, living guidance of the forest he had sworn to protect. The path was no longer a route, but a conversation. Where Kaelen had walked a clear trail before, gnarled roots now rose from the earth like knuckles, forcing him to step over them with deliberate care. Low-hanging branches draped like curtains, and he found himself pausing, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He needed to run, to sprint back to his village with the luminous spore burning a hole in his pouch. But every time he tried to rush, the forest responded. A vine would snake across his intended path, or a thicket would seem to tighten its weave, blocking his way entirely. It was a test, he realized, a relentless examination of his newfound respect. Brute force was not just useless here, it was a language this place did not understand. His urgency was a human problem, and the woods were teaching him a different pace, a more patient rhythm. He fought a desperate internal war, his mind screaming about the dying, about the precious seconds slipping away with every cautious step. Yet he remembered the weary judgment in Sylva's memories, the history of humans who took without asking. So he made a choice that felt absurd and utterly necessary. When a particularly dense wall of brambles refused to yield, he stopped, took a slow breath, and spoke to the empty air. "May I pass? I mean no harm." He waited, his entire body tense, until the branches shuddered and slowly, almost grudgingly, parted just enough for him to squeeze through. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice raw. He repeated this ritual again and again, thanking the woods for a route that moved aside, for a clearing that opened before him. Each word felt like a seed of trust being planted, but each delay was another drop of poison in his veins, feeding his terror. The greatest danger was no longer getting lost. It was the ticking clock of his own people's fear. With every moment he was delayed, the risk grew that his village would assume the worst. They would send a search party, armed with axes and torches, their hearts full of the very same fear and aggression that had wounded this forest for generations. Such a group, blundering into this sentient grove, would shatter his fragile pact with Silva in an instant. The cure in his pocket would become meaningless because the retaliation from an awakened, defensive ecosystem would be a catastrophe his village could not possibly survive. He was not just carrying a spore, he was carrying the only chance for peace, and the path itself seemed determined to make him fail. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the test ended. The tangled undergrowth fell away, the oppressive canopy thinned, and the familiar, dull light of the outside world washed over him. He stood at the very edge of the whispering woods, the spore safe in his hand. But his relief was strangled in his throat. There, 20 paces away, stood Alara. The village sentinel's bow was drawn, the sharpened flint tip of her arrow aimed unwaveringly at his heart. Her eyes were hard, reflecting not recognition, but the cold certainty that whatever stood before her was no longer the boy who had entered the woods. The flint arrowhead did not waver. Alara's voice was a low, cold thing, stripped of the familiarity they had shared since childhood. "You reek of the deep woods, Kaelen. What witchcraft did you bargain for in that cursed place? Hand it over, now." Every instinct screamed at him to obey, to placate the sharpened stone aimed at his heart. But the memory of the grove, of Sylva's weary judgment, was a stronger force. He saw his village's fear reflected in her eyes, a fear that would lead them to burn the only thing that could save them. His mission would end here, at the forest's edge, if he failed this first test. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing his hands to remain open and empty at his sides. "It is not witchcraft, Alara, it is a cure. The forest itself gave it to me." Her laugh was a short, harsh sound. "The forest is a place of shadows and poison. It does not give, it only takes. It took your senses, it seems. You have been bewitched." He could see the rigid certainty in her posture, the generations of superstition that painted the woods as a malevolent enemy. Arguing would only prove her right, so he made a choice that felt both terrifying and simple. He would not fight, and he would not run. He would show her the truth and trust it to speak for itself. With movements as slow and fluid as he could make them, he reached for the small leather pouch at his belt. Her bowstring tightened. "I am only going to show you," he said, his voice calm despite the frantic beating of his heart. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm. The pearlescent spore tumbled out, and in the dimming twilight, it pulsed with a soft, internal light, casting a gentle glow onto his skin. It was undeniably alive, and undeniably not of their world. It was given, not stolen, he repeated, his eyes locked on hers. The woods are not what we were taught. They are awake, they are conscious, and they remember every axe, every fire. They gave us this one chance. Alara's gaze flickered from the glowing spore to his face, the hard lines of her suspicion beginning to crack under the weight of an impossible reality. Her breath hitched. "You are mad," she whispered, but the conviction was bleeding from her voice. Just then, the trees behind Kaelen rustled. It was not the sound of wind, for the evening air was perfectly still. It was the sound of movement, of branches shifting with a purpose all their own. Alara's eyes widened, her focus snapping from the spore to the wall of foliage behind him. Her arrow, held for so long with a hunter's steady aim, began to tremble. It was not the tremor of fatigue, but of a primal, chilling realization. She was not just aiming at Kaelen. She was being watched. She could feel it, a pressure against her skin, a silent, ancient gaze pouring from the shadows between the trees. The forest was no longer a backdrop. It was a participant in their standoff, and it was waiting to see what she would do next. The arrow slipped from Alara's bowstring, its point sinking into the soft earth at her feet as her arms fell limp. Her mind was no longer her own. A vision, impossibly vivid and immediate, flooded her senses. She felt the ground shudder and roar, saw a wall of mud and rock tear down a mountainside toward a small figure. A young woman with her own determined eyes, her own proud posture. It was her great-grandmother, Lyra, separated from her hunting party and cornered by the collapsing slope. But the forest did not let her die. A great ancient oak, its roots woven deep into the stone, shifted its immense weight, its lower branches swooping down to form a living shield, a cradle of wood that deflected the crushing tide of earth and stone. The memory was not a story. It was a physical echo, carrying the scent of wet stone and torn roots, the taste of panic, and the profound, silent gratitude that followed. It was a memory that belonged not to her, but to the woods themselves, her family's oldest tale. The legend of Lyra's miraculous survival was not a legend at all. It was a recorded fact in the mind of the forest, a single thread in a vast tapestry of remembrance, the fear she had been taught, the certainty that the woods were a malevolent force, shattered against the truth of that benevolent, deliberate act. She looked from Kaelen's earnest face to the glowing spore in his hand, and then back to the silent, watching trees. The entity she had called a demon had saved her bloodline. The conflict was a storm inside her, a lifetime of indoctrination, warring with a truth she could feel in her very bones. Her voice was a ragged whisper when she finally found it. My great-grandmother, the story is true. She slowly, deliberately unstrung her bow, the gesture one of profound surrender. I will take you to Elder Morwen. She must hear this, but you must understand. Kaelen, she will see only madness. She will see a boy corrupted by the dark and a sentinel who has lost her nerve. They began the walk toward the village, the spore, a secret weight in Kaelen's pouch. The immediate danger of a violent end had passed, but a far more daunting trial now lay ahead. They were not just carrying a cure, they were carrying a story so monumental, so contrary to everything their people knew, that its mere telling could brand them as heretics or fools. The fate of the village now hinged not on a simple medicine, but on their ability to shatter a fundamental world. As they walked, Alara kept glancing back over her shoulder at the tree line. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a witness, a judge, a remembering heart, and in that moment, a cold shadow of doubt crossed her face. What if this was not a gift, but a trick? What if this single act of remembered kindness was merely a lure, a way for a patient, ancient intelligence to disarm them before a final, decisive strike? The trust she had just extended felt as fragile as the glowing spore itself, and just as easily crushed. The council hall was a cage of fear and suspicion. Elder Maeve, her face a roadmap of deep lines carved by years of hardship, stood before Kaelen, her gaze sharp enough to flay the truth from his bones. "You speak of a thinking forest," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You bring us a glowing trinket and a tale that defies all reason. The word of one boy, even one we trusted, is not enough. Prove it." The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Kaelen was not merely defending his story. He was standing trial for his sanity and his future. The fate of the cure, and the possibility of any future peace, hung on this single, impossible demand. How do you prove a consciousness that exists on a scale they could not comprehend? He felt the weight of every skeptical stare, the deep-seated fear of the unknown that had been their culture's foundation for generations. Arguing would only dig his grave deeper. He had to show them, not tell them. He took a steadying breath, his voice clear and resonant in the tense silence. "I cannot prove it in this room of stone and timber, Elder, but the proof waits for you. Join me at the forest's edge at dusk. Come and witness. The woods speak for themselves." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the gathered council. It was a reckless gamble, an act of absolute faith that placed the entire burden of proof onto the silent, waiting entity beyond their walls. If Sylva remained silent, Kaelen would be branded a liar or a lunatic, and the last hope for the cure would be extinguished by their own distrust. As the sun began to bleed into the horizon, the villagers gathered at the tree line, a nervous, shifting crowd wrapped in cloaks against the evening chill. They stood at the border of their world and the unknown, their fear a palpable cloud in the cooling air. Kaelen stepped forward, leaving the safety of the crowd behind. He stood alone before the wall of shadows, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The forest before him was unnervingly still, holding a silence so deep it felt like a held breath. He had staked everything on a hope, and now he had to take the final, terrifying step into the unknown. He closed his eyes, pushing his own fear aside, and reached out with his mind, not with a demand, but with a plea. "They are here. They need to see you. They need to understand." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched thin and brittle, and he could feel the doubt solidifying behind him into judgment. Then the leaves began to whisper. It started as a soft rustle, a sound that could have been the wind, but there was no wind. The sound grew, not in volume, but in complexity, layering into a haunting, melodic hum that seemed to emanate from the very wood and air. A collective gasp rose from the villagers as, one by one, the trees at the very edge of the woods began to glow. not with the fierce light of fire, but with the same soft, internal radiance as the spore, their bark illuminating from within to form intricate, swirling patterns of light that pulsed in time with the forest's melody. It was a display of conscious, coordinated beauty on a scale that defied any natural explanation. It was an answer. The intricate patterns of light pulsed across the ancient bark, a silent symphony written in living wood. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of fearful murmurs as the villagers shrank back from the impossible sight. This was not the malevolent darkness of their stories, but a display of conscious beauty and immense power that shattered their deepest held beliefs. Elder Maeve stood frozen, her face a mask of conflict. Every law, every tradition, every song sung to frighten children spoke of the woods as a mindless, dangerous thing. But the evidence shining before her eyes was undeniable, a truth so profound it threatened to collapse the very foundation of their culture. Her own authority, built upon that foundation, teetered on the brink. But the sight of the glowing trees also illuminated a path forward, one she had never dared to imagine. Swallowing the dry knot of fear in her throat, she took a single, deliberate step forward, leaving the safety of the crowd behind. Her voice, though laced with the tremor of awe, carried across the clearing with a leader's resolve. "We see you," she called out to the luminous trees. "Our people are sick, and our fear has made us blind. We ask you, what are your terms for peace? What must we do to receive this cure?" The air itself seemed to still, the humming melody of the woods softening to a whisper. The negotiation had begun, a fragile, unprecedented dialogue between a dying village and a waking world. The health of every man, woman, and child now hung in the balance against the safety and sanctity of the ancient grove. Then, the single, oldest tree at the very edge of the forest, its trunk a tapestry of swirling light, did the impossible. It leaned forward, its great branches creaking with a sound like old bones, bringing its luminous canopy down toward the stunned Elder Maeve. From its very core, a voice resonated, not in one mind, but in the air around them, a word so clear and resonant that every villager heard it simultaneously. Balance. The word hung in the air, a single, resonant command that demanded interpretation. All eyes turned to Kaelen. He was no longer just a messenger, but a conduit, the only one who could translate the forest's will. He took a steadying breath, feeling Sylva's intent flow into his mind, a complex web of conditions and reciprocation. The pact was not a simple trade, he explained. It was a covenant of balance. The village would be permitted to gather specific herbs and barks, but only from designated groves, and only under the light of specific moons, allowing the forest time to regenerate. In return, they were to become active guardians, planting new seeds from the wood's own bounty, and protecting its borders from any who would seek to exploit it with fire and axe. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. This was not just receiving a gift, it was accepting a partnership that would redefine their entire existence. Their identity, built on survival through cautious separation, was being challenged. Elder Maeve called for an immediate council vote. The debate that erupted was fierce and immediate. Traditionalists, their faces set in grim lines, argued that this was a trap, a sly trick to lull them into lowering their guard before the forest finally claimed them. They spoke of ancient tales, of whispers that spoke of demons who offered poisoned gifts. The progressives, their eyes alight with a new hope, countered that the old ways had only led them to sickness and scarcity. They saw in the glowing trees and the offered Pact a chance for a future built on respect, not fear. Kaelen listened, his heart aching with the division. Words were failing. The argument was circling a void of distrust. Then, his gaze fell upon a young mother at the edge of the crowd, cradling her listless daughter. The child's skin was pale, her breathing shallow. The sickness was upon her. A desperate, decisive clarity struck him. He pushed through the arguing elders and knelt before the mother. With a look that asked for permission, he carefully took the glowing spore from its pouch. As the council's shouts faded into a stunned silence, he held the pearlescent seed just above the child's forehead. It pulsed once, softly, and then dissolved into a shower of gentle light that sank into her skin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a healthy pink flush returned to the girl's cheeks. Her eyes fluttered open, clear and bright, and she looked up at her mother with a small, confused smile. The tangible miracle rendered the heated debate utterly meaningless. A profound hush fell over the villagers, so complete that the soft, melodic hum from the woods seemed to swell and fill the space. The proof was no longer a story or a strange light show. It was a healed child, breathing easily in her mother's arms. Under the watchful, luminous gaze of the ancient trees, the council members gathered. There were no more arguments to be made. Each elder held a smooth, dark stone, their faces grave with the weight of a decision that would echo for generations. They would cast their votes, and with each stone placed, they would choose between the fear of the past and the uncertain promise of a future woven together with the awakening woods. The final stone clacked into the polished wooden bowl, the sound echoing in the council hall's heavy silence. The vote was cast. By a margin of just 3 stones, the village had accepted the Pact of Balance. A collective breath was released, half in relief, half in trepidation. The decision was made, but the real work was only beginning. Elder Maeve's voice, though tired, carried a new, unshakable resolve as she turned to Kaelen. From this day forward, you will be our woods warden, our bridge to the consciousness we once feared. The weight of the title settled on him, a mantle of responsibility, far heavier than any physical burden. He met her gaze and gave a single, solemn nod, bowing silently to be the guardian the forest and the village both needed, but not all shared this newfound hope. Across the hall, a broad-shouldered hunter named Boren scowled, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "This is folly," he muttered to the men clustered around him, his voice a low growl. "We are trading our freedom for fairy lights and pretty words. We have lived by our own strength for generations, and now we bow to trees." His dissent was a smoldering ember in the heart of the village, a promise of future conflict. The crisis of the sickness had been averted, but a new, more insidious danger had emerged, the slow poison of internal strife and resentment. The first official act under the new pact was a ceremony at the forest's edge. As the sun rose, washing the world in pale gold, the entire village gathered. Kaelen, now the wood's warden, stood with Elder Maeve before a patch of freshly turned earth. From a woven basket, he took a handful of seeds gifted by Sylva, each one encased in a delicate, glowing husk. Together, they knelt and pressed the seeds into the soil, a ritual of hope and new beginnings. It was a simple act, but it symbolized everything, a physical bond between their community and the awakening woods. As the last seed was covered, a soft, approving hum resonated from the trees, and a single, luminous shoot pushed through the soil, unfurling its first leaf toward the sun. The Pact was now alive, growing in the earth itself, but Kaelen could not shake the feeling of Boren's cold stare on his back, a stark reminder that the most fragile thing he had to nurture was not the plants, but the trust of his own people. The first sanctioned harvest under the full moon was a test of faith in motion. Kaelen led a small, nervous group into the silver-dappled woods, the air cool and humming with a subtle energy. Among them, Boren walked with a heavy, deliberate tread, his silence a louder protest than any shout. As dictated by the Pact, they moved only through the designated groves, and an uncanny thing happened. The herbs they sought seemed to glow with a faint, internal light, making them impossible to miss. The leaves were thicker, the blossoms larger, and the scent that rose from their baskets was a potency they had never known, a clear sign of the wood's deliberate cooperation. This was not foraging, it was receiving a gift. Yet Boren's resentment festered with every step. His eyes, accustomed to taking what he needed by his own strength, scanned the shadowy spaces beyond the permitted paths. He spotted a cluster of rare, blue-capped fungi, thriving in a sunken hollow, a place clearly marked as forbidden by the absence of any glowing guidance. It was a direct challenge. While the others were distracted, he broke from the group, his knife already in his hand as he knelt to claim his prize. Kalen's voice cut through the quiet, calm but absolute. "Stop, do not touch them." Boren froze, his shoulders tensing. He slowly rose, turning to face the young woods warden, his expression a mask of contempt. "The forest provides, boy, or are you its jailer now?" The rest of the harvesters watched, their baskets forgotten, the air crackling with the tension of this first, public defiance. Kaelen did not back down. He walked forward, placing himself between Boren and the fungi. "The Pact provides, Boren. It gives us more than we ever had, but it demands our respect in return. This area is not for us. To take from here is to spit on the agreement that is keeping our people alive." Boren's knuckles were white around his knife. "You would choose a patch of dirt over one of your own. This is not about choice," Kaelen said, his voice low but carrying to every ear. "It is about trust. And you are breaking it." For a long, heart-stopping moment, it seemed Boren would shove past him. The authority of the Pact and Kalen's own fragile leadership hung on the edge of a blade. Then, with a disgusted grunt, Boren sheathed his knife. "Keep your fairy rules, Warden." He spat the title like a curse, but he took a step back, his submission a reluctant and temporary victory. As the group let out a collective, shaky breath, a soft rustle in the undergrowth drew their attention. From the deep shadows between the trees, a pack of wolves emerged. They were unlike any forest wolves they had ever seen, with sleek, silver-gray fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight and eyes that held a calm, unnerving intelligence. They did not snarl or advance. They simply stood, watching the humans with a quiet, assessing gaze, as if they were guardians ensuring the terms of the Pact were being honored. The silver-furred wolves moved with a fluid, unnerving grace, their paws making no sound on the soft earth. They did not growl or bare their teeth. Instead, they circled the terrified harvesters in a slow, deliberate orbit, their intelligent eyes passing over each human face, each trembling hand. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and wild musk, and for a moment, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the villagers. Then, the lead wolf, a massive creature with a scar across its muzzle, stepped forward. It lowered its head and sniffed at the basket of glowing herbs held by the nearest woman, its wet nose brushing the woven reeds. It gave a soft, almost imperceptible chuff, and then the entire pack simply turned and melted back into the shadows between the trees, vanishing as silently as they had appeared. The woods had not just spoken, it had sent its own guard for an inspection. The physical reality of that enforcement sent a fresh wave of primal terror through the group. This was no longer an abstract agreement. It was a treaty with teeth. Kaelen felt their fear, a cold, sharp thing in the air. He took a steadying breath, his own heart still hammering. "They are not hunters," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet panic. "They are guardians. Sylva is showing us that the Pact is protected. We are safe here, so long as we honor our word." His reassurance was a fragile shield against the deep-seated instinct to flee from such predators, but the message was chillingly clear. A violation of the rules was no longer just a breach of trust. It was a direct challenge to a sentient ecosystem and its formidable enforcers. The journey back to the village was a quiet, sober affair, the weight of the wolf's scrutiny hanging over them all. Yet when they returned with baskets overflowing with vibrant, potent herbs, a hesitant celebration began. The sheer abundance was a tangible reward for their faith, and for a few hours, music and relieved laughter filled the air. Kaelen moved through the crowd, accepting quiet thanks, but his eyes kept searching. He found Boren near the edge of the firelight, not celebrating, but staring into the flames with a grim intensity. As the festivities wore on, Kaelen watched the hunter turn and slip away from the gathering, his broad shoulders disappearing into the darkness between the huts. A cold dread settled in Kaelen's stomach as he realized the direction Boren was taking, leading straight toward the isolated home of a man known to set traps far beyond the village borders. The crackle of the celebration felt distant and hollow as Kaelen slipped into the shadows between the huts. He moved with a hunter's silence, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Boren's path was not headed toward his own home, but toward the village outskirts, to the rundown shack of Griswold, a man whose name was synonymous with forbidden traps and a disregard for any law but his own. Crouching behind a rain barrel, Kaelen watched as the two men met, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur in the dark. He caught only fragments, but they were enough. The words "Old Stag Trail" and "Heartwood" and "A King's Ransom in Timber" painted a terrifyingly clear picture. This was not just petty defiance. It was a planned, deliberate assault. They were going to poach the ancient, protected giants from the deep groves, the very trees that formed the core of Sylva's consciousness. The violation was so profound, it stole his breath. This was not merely breaking a rule. It was plunging a knife into the heart of the Pact, an act that would be seen not as the crime of two men, but as the betrayal of the entire village. Sylva's response would not be a warning, it would be a reckoning. Every instinct screamed at him to leap from his hiding place, to confront them with the full force of his authority as Wood's warden. But two against one, with Griswold's known temper and Boren's simmering rage, would likely end with him silenced in the mud, and the theft proceeding without any warning at all. The greater good demanded proof and witnesses. It demanded the law. His choice was a painful, necessary sacrifice of speed for strength. He would not confront them. He would expose them. Silently, he retreated from the barrel and turned, his feet carrying him swiftly back toward the heart of the village, toward Elder Maeve's lodge and the hope of finding Alara. This was no longer a simple disagreement. Boren's betrayal had escalated the conflict into an active conspiracy, a direct threat to the survival of everyone he was sworn to protect. As he hurried through the sleeping lanes, a sudden, sharp wave of psychic distress slammed into his mind, a feeling of violation and rising anger so potent it made him stumble. It was Sylva. The woods already knew. The theft had not yet begun, but the intent itself, a poison of greed blossoming so close to its borders, had been felt. Time was now a thread fraying into nothing. A searing pain lanced through Kaelin's temple, a psychic scream that was not his own. His vision swam, then cleared into a terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing the dirt path beneath his feet, but the forest's own memory. He saw the two ancient oaks, the sentinels of the deep grove, their bark etched with patterns that pulsed with a soft, golden light. He felt their immense age, the slow, patient thoughts woven through their roots like a vast, subterranean network. These were not merely trees. They were pillars of Sylva's mind, living libraries of memory and consciousness. Boren and Griswold, with their crude axes, were not planning to cut down lumber. They were aiming to sever a vital nerve, to commit an act of neurological butchery on a scale the village could not possibly comprehend. The forest's potential agony echoed in his own soul, a shared dread that made his hands tremble. He found Elder Maeve in her lodge, his words tumbling out in a desperate, breathless rush. It is not just a crime, Elder, it is an amputation. If they harm those trees, they will not just break the pact, they will wound the intelligence that sustains it. The forest's retaliation would not be a targeted strike. It would be a systemic collapse, a wave of defensive fury that would sweep our fields barren and poison our streams. Our future hinges on stopping them right now. Maeve's face, usually a mask of calm deliberation, paled. She heard the raw truth in his voice, saw the reflected terror in his eyes. The theoretical threat had become terrifyingly real. With a swift, grim nod, she granted him the authority he needed. Go, take who you trust, stop them. The blessing was given. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Kaelen and Alara moved with a grim urgency. They gathered a handful of villagers, men and women, whose loyalty had been forged during the first harvest, their faces set with determination. There was no time for lengthy planning. They were not a hunting party, but a rescue mission, plunging into the dark woods guided not by sight, but by the increasingly frantic whispers that threaded through Kaelin's mind. Sylva's fear was their map, a current of pure distress, pulling them deeper into the heart of the awakening woods, toward a confrontation that would decide if the fragile thread of understanding between two worlds would hold or snap forever. The ancient grove was a cathedral of shadow and soft light. Guided by the silent, panicked pull in his mind, Kaelen led his small team through the woods, their steps unnaturally muffled by the thick moss underfoot. They slipped between the massive, glowing roots of the two sentinel oaks, their bark swirling with faint golden patterns. The air here was thick with a psychic hum of alarm, and the very ground, seemed to vibrate with a deep, wounded tension. They crouched in the deep shadows, their breathing shallow, their eyes fixed on the dark path leading into the grove. They were an ambush laid not by their own design, but by the will of the forest itself, a last line of defense for a living mind. The crunch of heavy boots on dry leaves shattered the tense silence, just as the first gray light of pre-dawn touched the highest branches. Boren and Griswold emerged from the gloom, their forms made monstrous by the swinging lanterns they carried. The harsh yellow light cut through the grove's ethereal glow, a violent intrusion. They dragged a heavy wooden cart behind them, the thud of its wheels a jarring rhythm against the soft forest sounds. The cold steel of their axe heads glinted, promises of destruction. Kaelen felt Alara tense beside him, her hand gripping her bow. He could feel the collective urge to strike, to overwhelm the two men before they could even lift their tools. But violence here, in this sacred heart of the woods, would be a poison in the soil. Spilling blood on these roots would be a desecration Sylva might never forgive, a confirmation of humanity's inherent brutality. He made a choice, a gamble on words over weapons. His signal was a subtle, open-handed gesture. Hold, do not attack. Then he took a deep breath and stepped out from the cover of the giant roots, his own form suddenly illuminated by the invader's lantern light. Boren, we know why you are here. Lay down your axes. This does not have to end in violence. Boren jolted, his head snapping up. For a split second, raw shock was etched on his face, quickly hardening into a snarl of pure fury. His knuckles whitened on the axe handle. You, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. You would betray your own kind for these wretched trees. He raised the heavy axe, its blade a sliver of dawn's light. But before the weapon could even begin its deadly arc, the ground beneath their feet convulsed. A low, subterranean groan tore through the air as thick, coiling vines erupted from the soil like striking serpents. A web of living rope erupted from the earth, coiling around Boren's arms and legs with impossible speed. His axe clattered uselessly to the moss, the sound swallowed by the grove. Beside him, Griswold let out a choked cry as thick vines pinned him flat against the ground, their grip firm but not crushing. In the span of a single breath, the threat was neutralized, not by human hands, but by the soil itself. The villagers watched, frozen in a mixture of profound relief and primal terror. This was not the blind rage of a beast. It was a precise, calculated, and utterly restrained application of power. The entity they had made a pact with had just demonstrated it could disarm them as easily as it could provide for them. Kaelen stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at the two trapped men, at the raw fear in Boren's eyes, and felt no triumph, only a heavy, solemn responsibility. He knelt, his voice low and clear, meant for the captives but heard by all. The forest has every right to judge you for this trespass, he said, but our pact is about coexistence, not domination, so I offer you a choice. You can face judgment here by Sylva's law, or you can return with us and face the justice of the village. The air grew still, the entire grove seeming to lean in, waiting. This was the critical test. Would the village be allowed to govern its own, or would the woods assert its ultimate authority? Boren's defiance had vanished, replaced by a trembling, humbled awe. He had felt the conscious will in those vines, the immense age and patience behind that grip. He met Kaelin's gaze, his voice a ragged whisper. The village. I choose the village. As soon as the words left his lips, the vines loosened their hold, slithering back into the earth as silently as they had emerged. The two men were left sprawled on the ground, unharmed but utterly transformed. They had not been punished by the forest, only held and then released. It was a mercy more terrifying than any vengeance, a lesson in power that emphasized restraint. The message was unmistakable. Their fate was being entrusted back to human hands, a test of whether they were worthy of the trust the woods had placed in them. The judgment hall felt different this time, no longer a cage of fear, but a crucible for a new kind of law. Elder Maeve's voice was steady as she pronounced the sentence. Boren and Griswold would not see the inside of a prison cell. Their punishment was years of mandatory service, laboring to replant and tend the very woods they had sought to destroy, all under the direct supervision of the woods warden, Kaelen. A ripple of dissent and approval moved through the gathered villagers in equal measure. Some grumbled that the sentence was far too lenient for a crime that could have doomed them all, that exile or a lashing would have been a more fitting deterrent. Others, however, saw the profound wisdom in it. This was not about banishment or pain, but about healing the breach through action, a concept of restorative justice that was entirely foreign to their old ways. Kaelen accepted the responsibility without hesitation. He saw past Boren's simmering resentment and Griswold's sullen silence, viewing them not as prisoners to be guarded, but as souls to be converted. If he could turn these two hardened traditionalists into genuine allies of the woods, it would be the Pact's greatest victory. The stakes of this experiment were immense. This first major breach had been contained, but how they handled the perpetrators would set a precedent for every conflict to come, proving whether their new peace was built on punishment or on the harder, more hopeful work of redemption. As the seasons turned, the three of them worked side by side in the dappled light of the forest. The initial days were filled with a heavy, hostile silence, broken only by the scrape of their tools and Kaelen's quiet instructions. They learned to handle the glowing seeds with a reverence that felt alien, to read the subtle signs of the forest's health in the color of the leaves and the vibrancy of the moss. Boren, whose strength had once been wielded for taking, now used it to carefully lift young saplings into freshly dug earth. Griswold, whose cunning had been for setting traps, now applied it to weaving protective barriers against browsing deer. There were no grand speeches, no sudden moments of forgiveness. The change was as slow and patient as the growth of the trees themselves. It began with a grudging nod when Kaelen correctly predicted a coming rain, or a muttered observation from Griswold about a particular fungus that indicated healthy soil. The forest itself was their teacher, and its silent, persistent lessons began to wear down the walls of their defiance. A slow, cautious respect started to grow in the space between them, a fragile green shoot pushing through the hard-packed soil of their old prejudices. The rhythm of their new life was shattered by the frantic return of the Eastern Scouts. Their faces were pale, their words tumbling out in a frantic, fearful jumble as they described a creeping grayness spilling from the uncharted mountains. It was not a fire or a drought, but a blight, a magical decay that left a brittle, colorless death in its wake. Every plant it touched withered in moments, its life force extinguished, leaving behind a silent, gray scar that expanded slowly, relentlessly, toward the forest borders. Before Kaelen could even process the report, a psychic shriek of pure agony tore through his mind. It was Sylva. The consciousness of the woods recoiled from the advancing blight, as if from a physical acid. This was not a natural disease. It was an anathema to life, a null void that actively unwove the conscious patterns Silva was made of. The fear he felt from the forest was not just for its own survival, but a visceral horror at this unnatural erasure. The village council assembled in a storm of panic. The old fears resurfaced immediately. Let the woods deal with its own demons, some argued. This is not our fight. We should fortify the village and pray it passes us by. Kaelen stood before them, Sylva's silent screams still echoing in his soul. He did not speak of abstract duty or moral obligation. He spoke of the debt they owed. The forest could have crushed Boren and Griswold for their betrayal. He reminded them, his voice ringing with conviction. It chose restraint. It chose to trust us with their fate. It defended us from our own worst instincts. Now it faces an enemy it cannot reason with, a decay that seeks to unmake its very mind. If we hide behind our walls now, we are no better than the poachers we condemned. We will have proven that humanity's word is worthless. The stakes were absolute. If the awakening woods fell to this blight, the pact of balance would die with it. The healing herbs, the abundant harvests, the guarded streams, all of it would turn to gray dust. Their newfound symbiosis would collapse, and they would be left in a dead world, utterly alone. Silence fell, heavy and profound, as the council weighed survival against honor, fear against loyalty. Then, one by one, they voted. The decision was unanimous. Every able-bodied villager, from the strongest hunter to the most nimble gatherer, would march to the Blight's frontier. They would not carry axes or bows. Their weapons would be shovels, watering skins, and pouches, full of the luminous, Sylva-blessed seeds that pulsed with the forest's own defiant life force. They would make their stand not as conquerors, but as gardeners on the edge of annihilation. The line between the living woods and the dead gray waste was a battlefield. On one side, villagers worked in frantic, synchronized teams, their shovels biting into the untainted earth to plant the glowing seeds as fast as they could. On the other, the blight seeped forward, a silent, creeping nullity that made the very air feel thin and cold. But they were not fighting alone. The great silver wolves paced the perimeter, their low growls causing the advancing gray tendrils to recoil as if from a physical sound. Above, immense birds with feathers like polished stone circled, their sharp cries weaving a canopy of protective sound that seemed to reinforce the air itself. And the trees at the very edge leaned their branches forward, their leaves humming as they channeled a visible green-gold wave of life energy into the soil, a living barrier that pushed back against the decay. Where their combined efforts focused, the Blight's advance slowed, the gray pallor halting before the vibrant, defiant light of the new growth. The alliance was not just a concept anymore. It was a tangible force, and it was working. Yet the cost was immense. The work was a draining siege against an enemy that felt nothing. Tendrils of the gray corruption would occasionally lash out with shocking speed, and the corrosive magic was a physical danger. A young woman cried out as a wisp of the blight brushed her arm, the skin beneath her sleeve instantly turning ashen and numb. The collective effort was a shield, but it was a fragile one, and the Blight tested its seams relentlessly. It was in one of these violent surges that the true transformation of their alliance was forged. A thick, questing tendril of Blight shot past the defensive line of wolves, aiming directly for a villager who had stumbled while carrying a precious basket of seeds. Just as it was about to strike, a broad-shouldered figure slammed into the man, shoving him clear. It was Boren. He took the full force of the corrosive attack across his chest, the gray magic sizzling against his tunic before he fell to the ground with a choked gasp. The personal sacrifice of their most vocal former enemy sent a shockwave through the community, a silence falling over the frantic work. Here was a man who had once raised an axe against the Heartwood, now laying down his own body to protect one of its defenders. In that moment, any lingering division between villager and forest guardian evaporated, replaced by a unified, fierce determination. The Blight was vast, an endless gray tide, and as they fought it, a chilling realization settled over them all. Its movements were not random. It probed for weaknesses. It retreated from concerted efforts, only to strike at a new, undefended point. It seemed to possess a cold, malevolent intelligence, an awareness that this conscious resistance was something new, something it needed to systematically dismantle. As others rushed to carry the injured Boren to safety, Kaelen felt a sudden, profound shift in the psychic connection he shared with Sylva. The forest's attention was withdrawing from the surface battle, pulling away from the light and the noise. Its focus was turning inward and downward, plunging deep into the cold, dark soil, journeying along ancient root systems that stretched for miles. The real war was not here, on this scarred frontier. The decisive battle was beginning in a place no human eye could see, in the silent, subterranean heart of the world. The world above faded into a muffled, distant roar as Sylva's consciousness pulled Kaelen deep into the silent, subterranean realm. Here, in the darkness beneath the soil, ancient roots intertwined like colossal nerves, and he saw the truth. The Blight was not a mindless plague. It was a weapon, a venom being pumped into the world by a single, tormented source. His mind filled with the image of a colossal, ancient tree, its bark scarred with weeping black veins, its branches twisted into agonized claws. This was the Heartwood, one of the first awakened spirits, now corrupted by a forgotten dark magic and forced to broadcast its own suffering as a wave of annihilation. The only way to stop the decay was to journey to its epicenter and either heal the spirit's broken mind or sever its connection to the living network forever. The mission was a descent into a psychic maelstrom, a place where the very air would be thick with despair and madness. No other human could possibly endure it. Their mind would shatter in moments under the weight of such concentrated corruption. Kaelen understood this with a chilling clarity. He was the only bridge, the only soul woven so tightly with Sylva's own consciousness that he might have a chance to survive. He accepted without a moment of hesitation. This was the ultimate purpose of the Wood's Warden, the final, terrible test of the balance he had sworn to protect. The fate of every leaf, every stream, and every soul in the village now rested entirely on his shoulders and the strength of his bond with the awakening woods. As the villagers continued their desperate fight on the surface, unaware of the true battle to come, a single staff was brought forth. It was grown in an instant from Sylva's own Heartwood, a length of living wood that pulsed with a soft, steady golden light. a beacon against the coming darkness. Kaelen took it, his grip firm. He turned for one last look at his home, at the determined faces of his friends, illuminated by the defensive glow of the forest, and then he turned his back on them. With the staff in his hand, and Sylva's presence a steady hum in his mind, he took his first step across the threshold, walking alone into the dead, gray landscape. Every step forward was a battle against a world turned to ash. Beneath Kaelin's feet, the ground was brittle and gray, crumbling like ancient bone. The only color in this dead expanse was the soft, golden light pulsing from his staff, and with each deliberate touch to the barren soil, he poured a fragment of that life into the earth. A small circle of moss would shimmer into existence, glowing with defiant green, but the effort cost him. His breath grew shallow, his limbs heavy as stone, as if the very act of creation was draining his own life force to feed the tiny patches of purity. The silence here was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that smothered all hope. Then the whispers began, not in his ears, but in the dark corners of his mind. They showed him Alara turning to gray dust, the vibrant village square falling into silent ruin, the great wolves collapsing into piles of colorless ash. The visions were not threats, but certainties, a logical conclusion to a futile struggle. Why fight the inevitable? The silence seemed to ask. Lie down. Let the stillness take you. Your friends are already lost. The despair was a cold tide, threatening to drown his resolve. He stumbled, his strength nearly gone, his mind fraying at the edges. But in that moment of absolute weakness, he made a choice. He stopped fighting the visions and instead reached for a different memory, one he held deep within his bond with Sylva. He did not just remember the awakening woods, he channeled its living essence. He focused on the sensation of cool, damp moss under his hand, the symphony of the leaves humming at dusk, the overwhelming feeling of peace from the silent grove. He wrapped these memories around his mind like a shield, a tapestry of vibrant life woven against the gray. The corrosive whispers hissed and recoiled from this psychic light, unable to comprehend such stubborn joy. His sanity was the final frontier, and if it fell, he would become more than a casualty. He would become a new conduit for the Blight, a poisoned well from which the decay could spread with even greater intelligence and purpose. Gritting his teeth, he pushed onward, using his staff to part a final, petrified wall of thorns that clawed at his clothes with the grip of skeletal fingers. And then he emerged into a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in shadow. There, in the center, rooted in a pool of shimmering black sludge, stood the source of all the suffering. It was a tree, but one twisted by an agony so profound it was barely recognizable. Its bark was split and weeping rivulets of dark sap, and from its branches hung not leaves, but tattered, ghostly remnants of the conscious patterns it had been forced to destroy. The tree screamed without a sound, a psychic shriek of pure agony that tore through Kaelin's mind. Before him, the corrupted spirit was a monument of suffering, its branches writhing like tortured limbs, its bark split and weeping a dark, viscous fluid. He raised his glowing staff on instinct, a surge of defensive energy, ready to strike back at the physical roots that now snapped toward him like blackened whips. But in that crucial moment, a deeper understanding crystallized. To fight this entity with force, to meet its violence with more violence, would be to validate its entire corrupted worldview. It was a being born of pain, and pain only knew how to create more of itself. The cycle would never end. The true enemy was not the tree itself, but the torment that held it captive. Killing it was impossible, for its consciousness was woven into the very fabric of the living network. The only path forward, the only way to truly win, was a path no warrior would ever take. He had to heal it. As a barbed root lashed out, aiming to impale him, Kaelen made the most terrifying decision of his life. He lowered his staff. The golden light winked out. He stood completely defenseless before the onslaught, dropping every shield, both physical and mental. He closed his eyes and did not brace for the killing blow. Instead, he reached out with his heart, projecting not a plea or a demand, but a wave of pure, unconditional compassion. He sent the spirit memories of cool rain on sun-warmed leaves, of the patient, deep hum of the living grove, of the grateful smile of the healed child in his village. He offered it peace. It was the ultimate gamble, betting his life and the fate of two worlds on the radical idea that even the most poisoned heart still held a memory of light. For one terrifying, eternal moment, nothing happened. The attacking root hung motionless, a hair's breadth from his chest. The psychic screams faltered. Then a single, glistening tear of golden sap welled up from a fissure in the tortured bark and traced a slow, clean path down the blighted wood. His hands met the weeping bark. The contact was not a touch, but a fusion. Through him, Sylva poured the entire living memory of the awakening woods, a torrent of green gold energy that was more than power, it was meaning. He channeled the simple joy of a sprout breaking through the soil, the patient strength of a deep root, the fierce loyalty of the silver wolves, and the fragile, hard-won trust in a human heart. He gave it the memory of Alara's bow lowering, of Elder Maeve's first step forward, of Boren throwing himself in front of the Blight. He poured every moment of connection, every act of balance, directly into the spirit's core. The torrent of pain and despair fought back, a screaming void of isolation that had lasted for centuries, but it was no match for the sheer, undeniable weight of a world that cared. The violent, psychic shrieking faltered, then softened into a bewildered silence. The black, poison sap running from the tree's wounds shimmered, thinning from a viscous poison into a clear, water-like essence. The twisted branches groaned, not in agony, but in release, slowly untwisting and reaching toward the caverns, unseen ceiling as if feeling the sun for the first time in an age. Across the vast Deadlands, the creeping gray blight simply stopped. Then it began to crumble, dissolving into fine, harmless dust that was carried away on a sudden, clean wind. The war was over, won not by a weapon, but by an embrace. The cost was absolute. As the last of the healing light left him, Kaelen fell. The immense effort had burned through his own life force, leaving him a hollow shell. His heart beat a faint, faltering rhythm as he lay on the now softening earth, his consciousness fading into a deep and final cold. He had given everything. But the story was not over. The spirit, now serene and whole, observed the fallen human who had offered it salvation at the cost of his own existence. It had known only taking for so long. Now it chose to give. A single radiant bud formed on a low-hanging branch, swelling with a soft, white light before gently opening. From within, a shimmering mist of pure, Ancient life energy drifted down, enveloping Kalen's still form and seeping into his skin. It was a gift of years, a portion of the spirit's own timeless vitality, freely given to the one who had restored its mind. The warmth returned to his limbs, the steady rhythm returned to his heart, and his eyes fluttered open. He drew a deep, clean breath, and the air he inhaled was no longer dead and still. The entire cavern was now carpeted in lush, glowing mosses, and the gentle, melodic hum of a forest, reborn, echoed softly from the walls, a testament to a peace forged in the deepest darkness. The gray dust of the blight was gone, replaced by a carpet of lush, emerald moss that pulsed with a soft, internal light. Kaelen walked back through a world reborn, the air rich with the scent of damp earth and blooming night flowers. He did not walk alone. From the rejuvenated undergrowth, the great silver wolves emerged, falling into step beside him, their heads lowered not in submission, but in quiet respect. Above, the stone-feathered birds circled, their cries now a gentle, celebratory melody. The forest itself was his honor guard, a living testament to the peace he had forged. Then a voice cried out his name. Alara broke from the tree line, her face streaked with tears of disbelief and joy, and behind her came Boren, his own eyes wide with a humbled awe, leading a search party of villagers who stared in wonder at the transformed world. There were no words for the reunion, only a crushing embrace that spoke of fear overcome and a future reclaimed. Kaelen had returned, but he was no longer just the woods warden. He was a living bridge, his very existence proof that the bond between human and forest was now unbreakable, sealed by a sacrifice that had touched the very heart of creation. The final conflict was over, leaving in its wake a profound, unshakable unity. As they turned together to walk home, a final, beautiful miracle unfolded. With every step they took, new flowers bloomed instantly under their feet, their petals shimmering with every color of the dawn. This was no temporary enchantment. It was a permanent path of peace, a vibrant, living road woven from gratitude and symbiosis, forever connecting the fate of the village to the soul of the awakening woods. The ceremony took place at the heart of the great grove, where the entire village stood surrounded by the luminous trees. The air itself grew still, and then the voice of Sylva came, not from one tree, but from the rustling of every leaf and the hum of every root, a chorus speaking as one. It named Kaelen the Guardian of the Balance, a title that was not an honor, but a sacred fusion. In that moment, the connection he had forged became intrinsic, a part of his very being. He could now feel the forest's vitality as a steady warmth in his own chest, and its subtle distress as a fleeting ache in his bones. Communicating with Silva required no more effort than a single, focused thought. He accepted this immense duty with a quiet, solemn nod, fully understanding the cost. He would never again walk through the world as just a man. His life was now inextricably woven into the fate of the ancient woods, a permanent bridge between two worlds. His first act as guardian was to pledge that he would not be the last. He turned to the crowd, his gaze finding Boren, whose face now shone with a hard-won respect, and he vowed to teach anyone willing to learn the ways of the woods warden. He would train them to read the subtle signs of the forest, to understand its silent language, and to uphold the pact with the same reverence he held. With this decision, the legacy of the Alliance was secured, creating a system of guardianship designed to protect the balance for generations to come. That night, as Kaelen rested beneath the boughs of the great oak, his own thoughts began to slow and deepen. He did not dream of his past or his fears. Instead, his mind filled with the slow, vast dreams of the forest itself, visions of patient root growth and the timeless dance of seasons, a rhythm as old as the stones. His dreams were no longer his own. That night, his mind did not wander through memories of the village or fears for the future. Instead, Kaelin's consciousness dissolved into the vast, patient awareness of the awakening woods. He was no longer a man lying beneath a tree. He was the tree. He felt the slow, deliberate pull of water through xylem, a cool river ascending from the deepest roots to the highest, sun-seeking leaf. He was the leaf itself, its cells drinking in the morning light, a silent, joyous alchemy of air and energy that was both a physical process and a conscious, grateful thought. He was the badger, its claws scrabbling in the dark earth, the vibration of its movement, a message sent through the soil, a story of hunger and home that the network of roots understood and acknowledged. He experienced the growth of a root tip as a slow, persistent pressure against a stone, a patient negotiation with the earth that spanned weeks, felt in a single, timeless moment. Every process, from the decay of a fallen log to the unfurling of a fern, was not a blind biological function. It was a thought, a feeling, a note in a grand, harmonious symphony that had been playing for millennia. There was no separation, no individual struggle. The death of one organism was the nourishment for another, a seamless transfer of energy and memory that sustained the whole. In this state, the concept of conflict was alien. The forest did not fight the storm, it danced with it, its branches bending to the wind's will, its roots holding firm in the torrent. It did not battle the insects that nibbled its leaves. It welcomed them as partners in a cycle of consumption and rebirth. Kaelin's human mind, with its sharp edges of fear, ambition, and time, simply softened and merged into this ancient, patient wisdom. He did not resist this integration. He consciously opened every door within himself, allowing his singular perspective to be subsumed by the planetary scale consciousness of Sylva. He let go of the need to control, to understand, to be Kaelen. He simply was, and the forest was with him. This was the final, silent ceremony of his transformation. The man who had entered the woods as a desperate botanist was gone. In his place was a being who understood the ecosystem's needs and rhythms as instinctively as he understood his own heartbeat. He was no longer a bridge or a warden. He was now an integral, living part of the forest's own mind, a human nerve ending in a vast, conscious body. When the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, he awoke. There was no groggy transition from sleep, no lingering confusion. He opened his eyes with a profound and absolute certainty. His life's purpose was not something he had to find or fulfill. It was already complete, woven into the very fabric of the world around him. As if in answer, a gentle breeze swept through the grove, and every leaf on every tree rustled in a single, synchronized, joyful whisper, greeting the sun. The border was no longer a scar, but a seam, where the gray waste had once crept. A meadow now bloomed in impossible colors, each flower a tiny, conscious symphony of light and scent. Kaelen stood at its edge, the guardian of the balance, and felt the new life humming up through the soles of his boots. Then the air beside him shimmered, and the healed tree spirit manifested, no longer a vision of torment, but a being of woven light and ancient bark, its form both solid and ethereal. Without a word, they moved as one. Kaelen placed his human hand upon the warm soil, and the spirit laid its own hand of gnarled wood and gentle radiance beside it. The moment their touch met the earth, a visible wave of emerald energy pulsed outward, a ripple of pure, conscious life that sank deep into the bedrock. This was no mere regrowth. It was a vow, woven into the very substance of the land, a permanent shield against the emptiness of corruption. The unity they had forged in sacrifice was now the land's unbreakable law. Years had woven themselves into the fabric of the village, and Kaelen stood in the sun-dappled square with a circle of children at his feet. Streaks of vibrant green, like living moss, now traced through his hair, a gentle echo of the bond that pulsed within him. He did not tell the children stories of monsters or heroes. He taught them the language of the woods, how to listen for the subtle hum in a sun-warmed stone, and to understand the message in the pattern of fallen leaves. Across the square, Alara consulted with a gatherer, her keen eyes assessing a basket of glowing herbs, not for their quantity, but for the story of their growth, a testament to a successful season of balance. Nearby, Boren's laughter boomed as he showed a young apprentice how to gently train a new sapling's growth, his once calloused hands now moving with a tender precision. The old fear was a forgotten tale, a relic from a time before the great understanding. The pact was no longer an agreement. It was the rhythm of their lives, as natural as breathing. The children, born into this world, saw no division between the cobblestone streets and the luminous forest paths. The woods were not a place they visited, but a relative they lived beside, a vast, breathing entity that was part of their community. The village itself seemed to bloom with a borrowed consciousness, its gardens arranged in spirals that mirrored the growth patterns of the forest fungi, its songs harmonizing with the evening chorus of the trees. This was not mere survival, a tense truce between two wary forces. It was a shared evolution, a flourishing that neither side could have achieved alone. The story of Kaelin's first desperate journey was now a foundational myth, but it was not the end. It was the opening of a door. What new wonders would this sentient world reveal as the generations turned? What other sleeping consciousnesses might stir in the deep places of the earth, waiting for a bridge to be built? The adventure was far from over. It had only just begun to grow.
you.